first I would say I will start. I'm not sure if I can contribute to the issue of internet and online-offline borders, but I do my best to find some relations.
If not, we will find it. Don't worry.
Okay. So yes, maybe it's even in the title, culture as relational space, cultural differences in handling climate change in European coastal areas. So from that point of view, the question today would be, how do cultures constellate today in a world where cultural knowledge might be shared worldwide? For example, are national boundaries still cultural boundaries, or are there alternative boundaries in this sense? So from that point of view, I do research on climate change, and we can also ask these questions concerning with the dealings with climate change. And so the question would be, is climate change a paradigm for an emerging world culture, or are there continuing differences, cultural differences in handling climate change? This was one question we already asked in a project which was called How Societies Deal with Climate Change. We did this at the IRS some years ago. And what we did was we did research in 3 German coastal cities, and we looked at the development of climate change knowledge in these cities. And we had three different models. The first one was a public media discourse analysis. So we looked at the development of the discussion on climate change in the public media in these 3 cities. Then we had another module where we did qualitative interviews with experts in these 3 cities, and then another module which was more quantification oriented. It was a Delphi survey. And the interesting thing was that we found interesting differences. Especially between Lübeck and Rostock, both cities are quite close to each other, just 100 kilometers in line, and the physical structure and even the structures of the cities are quite the same. But there were interesting differences in the discourse. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010 in Lübeck, the discourse was always focused on the problems of climate change. So here, for example, you see that the cultural heritage is in threat, and all these issues were always discussed. On the other hand, in Rostock, they were more focusing on the opportunities of climate change. So there was always the discussion on, for example, the opportunities for the ecological development, for tourism. Tourism can be better, and so on. So this was one pattern we found. There was a quite different discourse. The story continued also on the county level. We have 2 counties, Schleswig-Holstein and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which are also quite close to each other. And after the last UN report in 2007 on climate change, there was a great debate. And in Schleswig-Holstein, they decided to do an upgrade of the dikes concerning to climate change with a 50 centimeter span, while at the same time in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern they rejected to do this, and they said there's still time to wait and see. So what do these results show? They show us that even when there are same natural science scenarios, these scenarios are treated differently. They can be treated differently in totally different ways, even on smaller scales, even on city levels. And this led me to a general question, or my general questions, which I did in my PhD. The questions were: how and why do spatial planning related agents across Europe perceive and handle climate change in different ways? So how can we describe cultural differences in the handling of climate change, and how can we explain cultural differences? To answer these questions, I did an online survey. It was a standardized online survey. I did it with agents which were responsible for spatial planning for the coastal communities, and I did this for all coastal communities in the Netherlands. Germany, Denmark, and Poland. And yes, I reached a data set of 830 agents. And so this was the empirical data. And then would be the question, how can we describe cultural differences by doing such a survey? So just in brief, my theoretical approach. With regard to social and communicative constructivism, I define culture as shared knowledge. And this is the shared knowledge of agents. And in the sense of climate change, we can differentiate between different forms of knowledge which can be shared. I differentiate between shared knowledge of vulnerability and shared resilience practices. So the first one would be, for example, shared perceptions of problems and opportunities concerning the climate change. And the second would be shared preferences for different practices. And this is just what I invented in this case was the approach to see culture as a relational space. And yeah, I'd like to go more into deep with this. First, are you conformed with spatial theory? A little bit, sort of. Okay, sort of. So I just make it in basic sense. So if you go throughout the history of thinking about space, there are two main concepts how space can be how space can be thought of. The first one is this one. This goes back to Aristotle. And I think this is something which, I don't know, in Germany every pupil at school learns that this is space. It has 3 dimensions and it can be filled with something and there is such a space. And this was called the absolute space, or Einstein criticized it as container space. So from that point of view you have a space and then you can fill in something. And on the other hand, there was another idea of how space can be founded, and this was the so-called relational space. And from that point of view, you have, for example, material. And the space is not different from, so it's not a container, but the space is constituted by relations between different materia and entities, for example. And this is something which came up from Leibniz, and then it's later on Einstein, and so that's more the current view on how space is thought of. And so now the idea is that if we compare cultures, we always, or in the traditional sense, we always compare cultures in a container space way. So people are asking, for example, what is the Polish culture connected to the German culture? But the question is, if we now have these transnational communication procedures, for example, the internet and so on, cultures could be constellated in a totally different way. And so my idea was to do a relational space concept of culture. And so we don't have these agents which are in a container, and then we say, okay, container space. The idea is to have a look at the shared knowledge of the agents, to compare if they are similar or not similar to each other, and then compare the knowledge of the agents. And then we can define cultures by the shared knowledge of the agents. For example, these red ones could be one culture, or even these blue ones could be one culture. But this is an empirical question, of course. And then the question is, what differentiates these cultures? So back to my climate change issue. If we can have a look at the shared knowledge of vulnerability, the perceptions how climate change is perceived, or at preferences for practices. And then in the second step, we can ask empirically what are the discriminating factors for these cultures. And this can be for example, a nation or a region or a city, but this can be also different things. For example, field affiliations, when people are working in administration, politics and so on, this could also be a discriminating factor for a culture. And then there's another question of how we can explain these differences. And in this case, I developed another explanatory model, and I use different forms of common knowledge to explain why differences emerge. And these are, for example, value orientations, beliefs, or different identities. So this is one example how I do this in the empirical sense. Just some water before. Okay, so that's the first step, to look at the shared perceptions of climate change problems. And what I did, I asked the agents if climate change is already taking place and if it's caused by humans, and they had to estimate on a scale from totally disagree to totally agree. And then I had two other questions concerned to the problem framing of climate change. Is climate change a global problem, no problem at all, or a very big problem? Or is climate change a local problem for the own city? And the results were 4 different groups. 2 which are convinced and 2 which are more skeptical. The first group are called the globally convinced ones. They are convinced of everything, so climate change is taking place, it's caused by humans, it's a global problem and a local problem for the own city. Then we have a second group of globally convinced. They are also convinced, but they are not convinced that climate change is a problem for the own city. And then we have 2 other groups, anthropogene skeptics. They are convinced that climate change is taking place, but they are not convinced that it's caused by humans. And another group which are skeptical in all questions. So the second question now is, what are the discriminating factors? And one way to do this is just to have a look at the frequencies. So what do we see? Indeed, there are differences between nationalities and also between fields of activities. One interesting result is that we have a bigger group of locally convinced ones when we look at environmental NGOs, which is not so astonishing. And then we can also have a look at how, if there are differences between nations, for example. And what we see is that, for example, in Denmark, we have a high number of convinced ones, so most of them are convinced. And then what I found really interesting is when we go to Poland, climate change seems to be discussed in a different way, because we have a bigger share of climate change skeptics. And yeah, that's something I think that's very typical also for Poland, but not only for Poland, also for the eastern countries of Europe. And there are different discourses in these areas. Okay, so a second example, which is related to the measures which are possible to act. And the interesting thing is that even when people are convinced of climate change, their preferences for the measures can differ in different ways. And what we have here, we have 4 groups, and they were built on, I asked if, how measures are necessary until 2025. And there are 3 different strategies. One is the protection strategy related to floods. Protection strategy means that we build dikes or technical constructions, so we have a more technical oriented approach. Then we can do renaturation, we can make space for the water, we can make room for the water, and by this we mitigate the problem that floods and water have more space. And then we have a third strategy, which means the integration strategy. We continue with the land use, but the water comes. And from that point of view, for example, we can build houses on piles or build houses on water. So here we have 4 groups, universalists, protectionists, renaturators and minimalists. And yeah, for example, universalists, they prefer all these strategies. Then we have protectionists. They are more oriented on classical technical protection strategies. Then another group of renaturators. They are more oriented for renaturation. And then a group of minimalists. So the question now is again, what makes the difference? And here it's interesting that we find national differences. For example, renaturation seems to be a bigger issue in Germany and in Denmark again. On the other hand, we have the groups of universalists, which are more in Netherlands and Poland. So this is also the make room for water strategy, for example, which is connected to this. And what I also found interesting that in Poland there's a bigger group of traditional protectionists which prefer technical protection. Okay, so now is the question, why do these differences emerge? What is the differences? What is the difference and what is it made of? And in this context I developed the so-called VBI approach to explain it. VBI because it's values, beliefs and identities which might influence how people internalize knowledge. The idea is a social constructivist one or a communicative constructivist one, because the idea is that the knowledge that you internalize in the past influences how you internalize knowledge in future. So, for example, if you have a certain value or a value orientation, this will influence how you internalize knowledge of climate change. And I'd like to give you an example. These are value orientations connected to Shalom Schwartz. He defines 10 basic values, and they are structured in an order, and there are 2 dimensions. So people can be more conservative, or they can be more open to change on the one hand, or they can be more self-oriented and altruism-oriented. So just in brief, the values. Then I use beliefs. Beliefs means here that people share different ideas how the world functions, and in this case how nature and humans are related to each other. And in the 1970s there was a discourse on environmental sociology for the Western societies, and they came to the conclusion that there was a change in the beliefs from human exceptionalism paradigm to the new ecological paradigm. Human exceptionalism paradigm means that people share the idea that people are intelligent, humans are intelligent, and they can do things, they can create things, they have technology, they have language, so they are somehow exceptional in nature and they can create things. Then there came a more pessimistic view. This is the new ecological paradigm, and from that point of view, humans are only part of a bigger ecological system, and they are bounded to limits in the system. So, for example, they might also be able to destroy the basis of their own survival, and from that point they are only a very small part of the whole system, so there is the human. Of how climate change is internalized, or the knowledge of climate change. And the idea is that agents can be less or more identify themselves with place. For example, you grow up in a city and then you have a bigger identification with the city than others who are not grown up there, for example. So this all together, I bring this all together in a model, and then the idea is to do a logistic regression and to calculate the probability of group affiliations. So in this case, for example, we can calculate or we can ask the question, for example, conservatives, are they more likely to be renaturators, or are they more likely to be protectionists? What would you say? Are conservatives more likely to be renaturators or protectionists?
Protectionists.
Okay, any other views? Or?
So I would say the difference between because you are not convinced.
And why would you say that they are protectionists?
Because they'll think. They will have faith in likely to strong. They'll have faith in the possibilities of human technological skills to protect themselves.
Okay, so let's have a look if you're right. So we have here conservatism, and we have a reference group of renaturators, and here we have the protectionists. So we look here. So yes, so right, you're right. Okay, so just to give you an impression of how we can explore this by statistical methods. So, so obviously there are differences, and there are cultural differences in handling climate change and handling natural threats, and this was, our idea was to continue our research and to go more into deep with this, and so we have a current project which is running now. We're working together with the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and we have also different modules, and the interesting thing is that we do this at the Oder River with 4 different cities. We have Frankfurt-Oder, Eisenhüttenstadt on the German side, and on the Polish side we have Słubice and Wrocław. And the idea was to go more into the history of both languages, and that's why we have our colleagues in Warsaw who do. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. Our colleagues in Warsaw who do literary discourse analysis. They are literary scientists, and they do discourse analysis with literature, and they go into deep until, the idea was to maybe go back to the 16th century, and then to have a look at how the literary discourse on floods and rivers developed. And then we have a second module where we do a public media discourse analysis in our cities again, concerning to the river discussions. And there were 2 bigger floods in 1997 and 2010, and so we have a look at how these floods are discussed. And then the third module, the idea is, of course, that discourse influences how actors will act locally. So there's a discourse, media discourse, literary discourse, and so on, and this influences the knowledge of the agents in the end. And that's one idea, how we bring this all together. And so we do qualitative interviews in these cities, also a questionnaire with 150 agents per city, and then we can have a look systematically how the knowledge is shared by the agents and how preferences, for example, are done, and how it is connected to these other discourse. So that's our current project. And we also offer internships.
This is the Beethoven project, yeah?
What?
This program, this is Beethoven.
Ah, yes, that is Beethoven. Yes, this is DFG in Beethoven. And, and I just wanted to say we also offer internships, so if you're interested. This is a really interesting project. So, just to come to the summary, what's new? The one question was, how can we describe cultural differences in a world where cultures might emerge deterritorialized? And so I introduced my idea of the, in German, relationaler Kulturraum, culture as relational space. So we look at the shared knowledge of agents. And how can we explain differences? We can prove discriminants, for example, the question how place discriminates these cultural spaces. And the second idea was to have a look at how different background knowledge influences the handling of climate change. That was my VBI module, values, beliefs, and identities. So thank you very much for your attention.